Hi, this is Gail Sokol, and on today's show, we're going to be discussing the 12 Steps to Yeast Spread, a series, Part 2.
Welcome to Baking Radio. Learn the art and science of baking with author, educator, and award-winning chef, Gail Sokol. Whether you've been baking your whole life or you're brand new to the world of baking and you're looking to build your confidence and learn new skills in the kitchen, you're in the right place. This is Baking Radio.
So today we're going to be continuing with our 12 Steps to Yeast Spread, our series. And when we last left off, we had measured or scaled our ingredients. We've mixed our ingredients and we've started our bulk fermentation. So our dough has been rising, and we are now going to go into the fourth step. At this point, your dough has been rising for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. It should be puffy and it should look like it's full of carbon dioxide. And you might even see some of those bubbles pop up. It's sort of cool. And if you have plastic wrap on it, the plastic wrap might be literally covering the dough. It might be actually trying to get out of the bowl. So the fourth step is called punching or degassing the dough. And some people actually like to give their dough a little punch. That's not exactly what has to happen. But you do want to get rid of the gas bubbles that are in there currently. So you lightly push down on the dough. I usually like to pull up on the edges of the dough, pull them up and push them down into the center and go all the way around the bowl and do that. Should be done very gently. And you'll see the dough will actually collapse, almost like a balloon is losing air. And you'll see the carbon dioxide will just go off into the atmosphere and any air that's built up. This act of degassing is very important. It actually evens out the temperature of the dough and it redistributes the yeast so that it can find a fresh food supply inside the dough. Because what did I say? My first part of the series, fermentation, once it starts, it's not going to stop until we get this thing into the oven. So the yeast are still going strong and they're multiplying and they're producing carbon dioxide. So this brings us to our fifth step, scaling the dough or dividing it into portions. Now, I know you've heard the word scaling. Scaling meant measuring our ingredients, right? Well, this is a second term or a second use of the word scaling. So scaling can also mean to divide your dough up. So once it's been degassed or punched down, we want to actually cut the dough either in half. So we want to make maybe two round loaves, or maybe we're making 4 baguettes, or we're making brioche, or we're making challah, and we're dividing it into 3 segments, equal segments for braids. Whatever it is, you're going to divide it with either a sharp knife or a dough cutter into the sizes that you want. So you want to not rip the gluten. So you'll see this beautiful stretchy dough, and it will be gorgeous. I think doughs, after they've been rising, are a beautiful thing. And once you see that they have risen, you don't want to rip that gluten apart and break it. That will actually hurt the structure ultimately. So you want to pour it out of the bowl and then cut with your dough cutter. Remember that tool with the either rubber or wooden handle and that square metal piece, which will cut into it, also known as a bench scraper. So I have an experience to share about how fermentation continues. I mean, this is wild. So I was working in a restaurant and I had probably the biggest ball of dough I've ever seen in my life because we were working on a floor mixer, and floor mixers are very big. They're too big to put on a table. So it was massive. And I poured this dough onto the table, and the table wasn't that big, but this thing looked like a blob. It was probably as big as I was. And I was cutting with my little scale and cutting with my bench scraper or my dough cutter and cutting into, we were making like rolls. I was cutting like 6-ounce pieces, and then we were making some baguettes. So I was making all different sizes with this giant yeasted bread dough. And I was putting the little blobs side by side. And as I was doing it, they're growing into each other. So I had to go super fast. It was crazy. So this shows you fermentation doesn't stop. So if you do start dividing or scaling your dough, make sure that you separate them out a little bit. And of course, you're not going to be using as large a bolus of dough as I was. I mean, this was really massive. So once you have your dough divided, and it might be just as simple as I need to divide my dough in half. If you were a professional baker, you might weigh your entire ball of dough or your dough, and then you would just divide it in half. So if it was 1 pound, 1 pound is 16 ounces. Each loaf would be 8 ounces. If you don't have a scale, don't worry about it. I just eyeball it usually. If you want to get into 35 different little pieces and you're making little rolls, you may want to weigh each one into 2 ounces or 3, whatever you feel comfortable with, whatever you're making. So that is the dividing or the scaling the dough step. So that was the 5th step. Now the 6th step is known as rounding. So after the dough is divided into its proper sizes, the next step is called rounding. For this step, this is sort of a cool step because you may not think it does anything, but it's doing quite a bit. And it takes a little bit of a knack to do this. So on my work surface, I will either put a spritz bottle of water nearby. If you don't have a spritz bottle that you can make and fill it with water, and don't use an old Windex bottle or anything that's very dangerous, you can just sprinkle a little bit of water, but very little. You're trying to create some friction on your work surface. So you will actually either take a little bit of that water, like I said, or maybe even a few drops of oil, like a vegetable oil or an olive oil would be nice. And you're going to take your little balls of dough or your big ball of dough, and you're going to rub it over the work surface. Let's say you're making a little roll. You're going to take your little ball of dough, one little ball of dough, and you're going to form a C with your hand. So your middle finger and your thumb are going to be around this dough, and you're going to rub it across the work surface so that it actually stretches and smooths the dough out, and it actually will form a thin skin. And when you form a thin skin, this is gluten, and it will help to keep carbon dioxide inside that dough. Isn't that the craziest thing? So we're trying to harness and trap this carbon dioxide. This helps. This step really helps it. You'll never see this step when you're making a pizza dough. So this is one step that is not done when you make a pizza dough, but when you're making rolls and baguettes and things like that, you will round because you're not shaping yet, you're just rounding. So again, fermentation is continuing, and by cradling this dough, we are trying to get this round, as smooth around as possible, because that'll keep and harness and trap these CO2 bubbles, these carbon dioxide gas bubbles, and even air to stay inside. So that was our 6th step. Our 7th step is known as benching or resting. So in this step, the rounded balls of dough, remember, we haven't shaped anything yet, so it doesn't matter what you're making. Could be baguette, could be anything. Monkey bread, which are little balls of dough that are put into a tube pan, could be anything. You're still taking these little rounded balls, and you're going to cover them with a kitchen towel or some form of greased plastic wrap that you spray with a nonstick cooking spray, and just put it on top of the dough and allow it to rest, maybe for 10, 20 minutes, but make sure you space them. Remember my blob of dough from that restaurant I used to work in. You don't want them to grow together. This resting period, another very, very helpful step. So resting allows the gluten to relax. And the cool thing about gluten, if you've overworked it, like my 5-year-old with the pizza dough from our previous show, gluten will relax if you give it a few minutes. And if you relax it, it makes shaping the dough, which is our next step, that much easier. So a little bit of rest, sort of like when, the coach for that athletes, maybe a basketball game or football game says, hey, you're getting tired or you're getting a little crazy out there on the field, go to the bench, take a rest. That's what it's there for. Let that athlete get his head, back in the game and get his act together. So same thing for the dough. This little respite, this little rest will allow that protein matrix to unwind a little bit and will make it that much more extensible, more easily shaped. Extensible is a word that I like to use, that bakers like to use. Extensible, more easily shaped. And this way, you'll be able to shape it, whether it's going to be a roll, a braid, a baguette, a round, whatever it is. Because if the gluten is too developed, it will be, for lack of a better word, rubber bandish. It will act like a rubber band and it will literally boing right back. You will not be able to shape it. So this 7th step, this benching or resting, is crucial. Now we go to our 8th step. So once it's relaxed, the next step is makeup or panning. So this is where we actually get to shape our dough. And to be honest with you, I'm going to admit this to you. This is the most fun step as far as I'm concerned. This is where I love to shape the dough. This is where you get your hands on the dough and you're actually shaping the roll, the braid, the ball of dough. This is a great thing to do with family members and kids. It's so much fun because you're getting your hands on. And when I give classes with adults or kids, the room is completely quiet. Most of the time they're like gabbing and chatting to each other. Here, when they're shaping, there's no talking. They're having so much fun. They are totally engrossed. So once you've shaped the forms of whatever you're making, whether it's a braid or a roll, whatever, you're going to place it on a sheet pan, maybe covered with parchment paper, or in a greased loaf pan, whatever you are making. And at this stage, once the dough is formed, you don't want to touch it again. Don't touch it again. So I've seen people shape the dough and then say, wow, you know what? I don't like the way it's shaped. I want to redo it. Nope. You had your chance. Now don't mess with the dough. It will cause it to deflate. It will cause the gluten strands to give up that carbon dioxide, and you will have a very misshapen, for lack of a better word, weird yeast dough. So don't mess with it. So once it's shaped, leave it alone. Put it and be happy with what it's shaped like. So if you're not happy, make sure you know what you're doing beforehand. So you don't want to deflate it. So the sheet pan or the loaf pan or whatever pan you're putting it in, it could even be a muffin pan. Clover leaf rolls, 3-leaf clover leaf rolls have 3 little balls that are put into muffin pans. They're usually greased as well. You will just have these sheet pans or loaf pans or muffin pans covered with a clean kitchen towel or greased parchment paper again, because at this point, we are going to go into step 9, which is proofing. So this is the final rise. This is the last rise, the last really fermentation period before we're allowing fermentation to continue so that the dough will rise one last time before we bake it, before we finally end this beautiful, beautiful yeast and actually decide to eat it. So proofing is a very, very important step. And if you are shaping your dough, before you proof your dough, you don't want to use too much flour. If it says a lightly floured surface, I try not to use any flour if I can help it, because flour can dry out your dough. So be very cautious when you're overflouring your work surface. But once you're proofing it, it may be a shorter period of time than your bulk fermentation. So proofing, step 9, is the same as your bulk fermentation, but this time the dough is shaped like something. It's shaped like what it's going to be, all right? What it's going to be formed as. Now, it's important to note that if you have a sweet dough or a rich doughs are known to have butter in them, eggs in them, sugar in them, unlike a pizza dough that has no sugar, no butter. It's known as a lean dough. If it has a lot of fat or sugar in it, it may not rise as much because this fat and sugar will interfere with gluten formation, and the gluten will be a little bit less. You'll have beautiful structure. You'll just have a lot more tenderness in that particular coffee cake or brioche, which is loaded with butter and delicious, by the way. But it will be a little different than a lean dough, like a French bread or an Italian bread. So we're leaving our dough to rise one last time. It may be 30 minutes. It may be an hour. You're going to look and you're going to see what this puffiness will be. And you'll see your braided dough, your whatever you're making will rise up. And when you slowly put your finger into it, it will not push back all the way. Your indentation of your finger may not come all the way back. That's how you know fermentation is done and it's ready for the oven, which is exciting. So we have been through our, we've actually been going through many different phases. So our fourth step, punching or degassing. Our fifth step was scaling or dividing our dough. Our sixth step was rounding. Our seventh step was benching or resting to relax that gluten. Our eighth step was actually getting our hands on the dough and makeup or panning. And then our ninth step was proofing. So through all this, I'm going to say it like I did at the end of our first 12 Steps to Yeast Spread series. Fermentation yet continues. So if you've enjoyed the episode today, hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to leave a review, I would greatly appreciate it. If you haven't picked up a copy of my most recent book, Baking with Success, it is available on Amazon and in bookshops worldwide. If you have any questions, head on over to bakingradio.com and leave me a message. I would love to answer some of your questions on air. And next show, we're going to be discussing the 12 Steps to Yeast Spread, a series, part 3.